The moment she lifted the metal door, Margaret Collins felt something she couldn't explain, like she was about to meet a version of her husband she had never known. At 72, Margaret believed she had already faced the hardest part of life. Just 3 months earlier, she had buried her husband, Walter Collins, after a sudden stroke took him on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday. For 50 years, Walter had been predictable, steady, the kind of man who followed the same routine every day, drank his coffee at the same spot, and left the house twice a week for what he simply called errands. She had never questioned it. Why would she? Their life in a quiet Ohio town had always been simple, comfortable, and honest, or so she thought. Then the letter arrived. A plain envelope forwarded from the post office, reminding Walter about a storage unit payment. At first, Margaret assumed it was a mistake, but the details were clear. His name, the account number, and a rental history stretching back nearly 20 years. 20 years. The number echoed in her mind as she sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. What could he have been hiding for that long? Why had he never said a word? Days passed, but the question refused to fade, and eventually curiosity became stronger than grief. So Margaret drove across town, key in hand, and stood in front of Unit C-17, unaware that the man she had loved for half a century had left behind a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about him. For several days, Margaret Collins tried to ignore the letter, convincing herself it was probably nothing, old paperwork, forgotten tools, something her husband simply never got around to canceling. But the more she tried to push it aside, the louder the question became. 20 years. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't something you forget. Each time she passed Walter's empty chair in the living room, she felt it again. That quiet, unsettling thought that maybe there were parts of his life she had never seen. It didn't feel like betrayal, exactly. It felt incomplete. Like a story she had lived inside without ever reading all the pages. Finally, one cool Thursday morning, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Margaret got into her car and drove across town, following the address printed on the notice until she reached a long row of beige storage units behind a chain-link fence. The place looked ordinary, almost disappointingly so. No sign of mystery, no hint of anything extraordinary. Inside the office, a young manager checked the records and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Your husband rented Unit C-17 for quite a while. You're listed as the emergency contact." He handed her a small brass key. Margaret thanked him quietly and walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing softly as she passed identical metal doors. C-13, C-14, C-15. Her heartbeat slowed, then quickened again as she reached the end. C-17. She stood there for a moment, staring at the number, her hand tightening around the key. Because deep down, she understood something now. Whatever was behind this door might change everything she believed about the man she had loved for 50 years. With a slow breath, Margaret Collins slid the small brass key into the lock and turned it. The sharp, metallic click echoed down the quiet corridor, louder than she expected. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hand rested on the handle, as if she could still choose not to know. But she had already come too far. Carefully, she lifted the rolling door. She expected darkness, dust, maybe stacks of forgotten boxes, something ordinary, something that would make all of this feel like a misunderstanding. Instead, she stepped back in stunned silence. The space inside wasn't chaotic or neglected. It was organized, perfectly organized. A desk stood against the far wall. Filing cabinets lined one side. Shelves held neatly labeled boxes arranged with precision. On the back wall, a corkboard was covered with photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. This wasn't storage. It was a workspace. Margaret walked inside slowly, her footsteps soft against the concrete floor as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Everything felt intentional, planned, maintained, used, not abandoned. Her eyes settled on a binder sitting on the desk. She hesitated, then reached for it. The label read, "Family Assistance, 2012. A small frown crossed her face as she opened it. Inside were documents, names, addresses, receipts, handwritten notes in Walter's familiar handwriting. Rent paid for March and April. Margaret's breath caught. She flipped to the next page, then another. And with each line she read, one quiet realization began to form. The man she thought she knew had been living a life she had never seen. At first, Margaret Collins didn't fully understand what she was looking at. The documents felt too specific, too deliberate to be random, yet too personal to belong to a stranger. She sat down slowly at the desk, her eyes scanning line after line, trying to make sense of the pattern forming in front of her. Each folder told a story: a family facing eviction, a child needing surgery, a parent struggling to keep food on the table, and beside each situation, the same quiet action. Rent covered for 3 months. Medical bill paid in full. Groceries delivered weekly. Margaret's hands began to tremble as she reached for another binder, then another. The names were different. The circumstances changed, but the result was always the same. Someone had stepped in, quietly, and helped. Her gaze slowly lifted to the corkboard on the wall. Photographs of families she had never met. Smiling children. Handwritten thank you notes pinned beside them. One message read, "You saved our family when we had nowhere else to go." Another said, "We'll never forget what you did for us." A strange tightness filled her chest, because she was beginning to understand. For 20 years, while she believed Walter was simply running errands, he had been coming here, to this small, hidden space, to change people's lives without anyone ever knowing. Not for recognition, not for praise, just because he could. And suddenly, Margaret realized something that both amazed and unsettled her. The man she had loved for 50 years was far more than she had ever imagined. Drawn by a quiet need to understand more, Margaret Collins turned her attention to the laptop sitting on the desk. It looked simple, almost outdated, but it powered on without hesitation, as if it had been waiting. The screen lit up to a clean, minimal desktop with only a few folders. One in particular caught her eye. Second Start. Margaret hesitated for a moment before clicking it open. Inside were spreadsheets, rows of names, dates, and notes written with the same careful precision she recognized from Walter's handwriting. Rent paid, medical assistance, car repairs, school tuition. The amounts varied, some small, others large, but every entry followed the same quiet pattern: help given without expectation. She leaned back slightly, her mind racing. This wasn't occasional generosity. This was a system, a mission. Her eyes drifted to a small drawer beneath the desk. It was locked, but a key had been taped neatly under the edge of the tabletop, hidden in plain sight. Margaret retrieved it slowly, her fingers steady now, and unlocked the drawer. Inside was a thick, worn leather notebook. She opened it carefully. The first page was dated nearly 20 years earlier. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter's. Met a man outside the grocery store today who lost his job and his home in the same month. Made me realize how quickly life can fall apart. Margaret's chest tightened as she turned the page. If I ever get the chance to help someone before it reaches that point, I should. She paused, her eyes lingering on the words. This wasn't something he stumbled into. It was something he chose. And page by page, she began to see it clearly. Her husband hadn't been hiding a secret life. He had been living a purpose. Margaret's fingers lingered on the edge of the worn notebook as she turned to the final pages, her heart already heavy with what she had discovered. The handwriting grew slightly unsteady, but it was still unmistakably Walter's, careful, thoughtful, deliberate. Each entry spoke of the same quiet commitment. Families on the edge of losing everything. Parents overwhelmed by medical bills. Children whose futures depended on opportunities their families could barely afford. And every time, Walter had made the same decision to help without being seen. Then Margaret reached the last page. She paused. The date was only a few weeks before he passed. Her breath slowed as she began to read. If Margaret ever finds this place, I hope she understands why I kept it quiet. I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to help where I could. Her vision blurred. She pressed her hand gently against the page, steadying herself as the weight of his words settled in. If she chooses to continue this work, she'll do it better than I ever did. Margaret closed the notebook slowly, her chest tightening with a mixture of grief and something else, something deeper. Purpose. For 50 years, she had believed she understood the man she loved. But now she realized he had been carrying something far greater than routine, far greater than predictability. He had been building something quietly, patiently, one life at a time. And now, standing alone in that small hidden room, Margaret understood the truth he had left behind. This wasn't just a secret. It was a choice. And now, it was hers. For a long time, Margaret Collins sat quietly in that small room, the notebook resting in her lap as the silence around her took on a different meaning. When she first arrived, everything had felt unfamiliar, like she had stepped into a stranger's life. But now, as she looked around, she began to see it clearly. This wasn't a secret meant to hide. It was something meant to be protected. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself returning to the storage unit again and again. At first, she simply organized the files, reading through the folders with a careful attention that mirrored the way Walter had arranged them. But as she went deeper, something began to trouble her. Some of the notes were recent. Some of the families he had helped were still in need. One afternoon, she opened a folder labeled with a name she didn't recognize, Danielle Parker. Inside were records of rent payments made during a medical emergency, along with a final note written in Walter's hand. Follow up next month. Margaret stared at the words for a long time. He had never gotten the chance, but she could. The thought settled slowly, not as a burden, but as something steady and clear. For the first time since losing him, she felt a direction forming in front of her. This wasn't about uncovering the past anymore. It was about deciding what to do with it. And as she closed the folder and reached for her checkbook, Margaret understood something she hadn't expected. His story hadn't ended. It had simply been placed in her hands. The first time Margaret Collins wrote a check from the account her husband had quietly used for years, her hand paused for just a moment. It felt unfamiliar, almost like she was stepping into a role that didn't belong to her. But then she thought about the note she had read. Follow up next month. So she finished writing it. Later that afternoon, she drove to the address listed in the folder and delivered the payment anonymously, just as Walter had always done. No explanation, no name, just help arriving exactly when it was needed. As she walked back to her car, something inside her shifted. The weight she had been carrying since his passing, grief, confusion, the quiet emptiness, felt just a little lighter. And for the first time in months, she felt useful again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Margaret returned to the storage unit regularly, updating the records, reviewing the files, and continuing the work her husband had started. She followed the same simple principle he had written in his journal. Kindness works best when nobody is watching. Word began to spread quietly through the community. Rent payments appeared just before eviction notices. Groceries were delivered during difficult weeks. School fees were covered without explanation. No one knew where it was coming from. Margaret preferred it that way, because she understood now this wasn't about recognition. It was about continuing something that had never been meant to be seen, but was always meant to matter. Nearly a year later, Margaret Collins stood once again inside the small storage unit that had once felt like a doorway into a stranger's life. But now, everything in that room felt familiar, alive with purpose, not mystery. The desk remained in the same place. The filing cabinets were still lined neatly against the wall. The corkboard still held photographs of families whose lives had quietly changed. But there was something new now, a fresh notebook. Margaret walked over, opened it slowly, and ran her fingers across the first page before picking up a pen. For a moment, she hesitated, not because she didn't know what to write, but because she understood what it meant. Then she began. Today, I helped a family keep their home. The words felt simple, but they carried weight. She paused, her eyes softening as she added one more line beneath it. Walter would have done the same. Closing the notebook, Margaret looked around the room, her heart steady in a way she hadn't felt since before she lost him. She had spent 50 years believing she understood her husband completely. But in the end, it wasn't what she had known about him that mattered most. It was what he had quietly become. And now, somehow, that same quiet purpose had found its way into her life. Because the truth was simple. He hadn't just left behind a hidden story. He had left behind something far greater. A legacy. And now, she was living it. Long after the questions had faded and the shock had settled, Margaret Collins began to see everything differently. Not just the storage unit, not just her husband, but her own life as well. At 72, she had believed her story was already written, that the years ahead would be quiet, predictable, and slowly winding down. But standing in that small, organized room, surrounded by records of lives quietly changed, she realized something she had never expected. Her life wasn't ending. It was shifting. The grief she once carried so heavily no longer felt like an empty space. It had become something else, a doorway. Not to the past, but to something meaningful she had never imagined for herself. Each visit to the storage unit, each file she opened, each quiet act of help she continued. It all built a sense of purpose that felt stronger than anything she had known before. Margaret no longer thought of her husband's hidden work as a secret. She thought of it as a gift. Not the kind that comes wrapped or explained, but the kind that changes who you are once you understand it. And in that understanding, she found something most people spend their entire lives searching for: clarity. Because now, when she woke up each morning, she didn't just remember the man she had lost. She carried forward the reason he had quietly lived the way he did. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret wasn't just moving through her days. She was living them with intention. She didn't expect to find meaning again at 72. But inside that quiet storage unit, Margaret Collins realized something she had never seen before. Her husband hadn't just lived a life she didn't know about. He had lived a life that mattered more than she ever imagined. The man she thought was predictable, routine, ordinary, had been quietly changing lives for nearly 20 years. And standing there, surrounded by letters, records, and stories of people he had helped, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not betrayal, but understanding. Because what he had hidden wasn't a lie. It was a purpose he chose to carry alone. And now, without saying it out loud, he had passed it on to her. Sometimes the truth doesn't break your heart. It expands it. You may never fully understand the people you love. You may never know everything they've done, everything they've carried, or everything they chose not to tell you. But that doesn't make their love smaller. It makes it deeper. Because the greatest things people do in life are often the ones no one ever sees. And sometimes, the most powerful legacy isn't what someone leaves behind for you. It's what they inspire you to become. If this story touched you, comment below. Would you continue a mission, even if no one ever knew it was you? And don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, the next story you hear might change the way you see your own life.